Good evening, everybody. Sean here. Hope that you're all doing good. Had an awesome day at work today. Went really good. Felt productive all day. Met with my cousins for lunch. Beautiful. So I hope you had a great day. Sky was blue. Felt warmish out. Anyways, I'm here today. I've sort of been obsessed for a few years now with a book called 0 to 1, which is right here by Peter Thiel. So Peter Thiel, you may know, is a famous billionaire who made his money through PayPal on the front end, I guess, was his first big score, and a number of other projects he's been involved with since. He's sort of notorious for being a fairly sort of conservative libertarian type, and for backing Donald Trump. You may have missed his speech at the, I think it was the 2016 Republican convention, where he said he came out essentially as gay and a Republican, which drew a huge amount of applause. But anyways, very intelligent gentleman, very clear thinker, good communicator, and I really enjoyed this book. I loaned it to my dad. We sit and talk about it quite a bit, and it's I've posted quite a few blog posts that have to do with it, and I've done a YouTube video on it before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of work through his book, but I'm going to focus on the parts of it that are of most interest to me. So some of it has to do directly with the nature of businesses, successful businesses, and although that is of interest to me, what really turns my crank is the more historical side of things that Peter Thiel talks about. So I'm not going to go through the book chapter by chapter, but I am going to hop around a bit and see whatever strikes me, and that's going to be more or less chronological as set out in the book, but not quite. So today I'm going to read from the chapter entitled "You Are Not a Lottery Ticket." I'm going to focus on a particular part of that. So, you are not a lottery ticket. The chapter is sort of focused on how predictable is success. I mean, how predictable is Bill Gates? Was he born that way, or is it luck, or is it some combination of the two? And in that, he sort of lays out a bit of a framework for some of the things he's going to discuss in future chapters. But I think it's a really interesting framework that I use and that I look at when I think about our society or past societies or other societies in the world. So he basically breaks down sort of these almost social moods into four categories. One is definite optimist, indefinite optimist, definite pessimist, and indefinite pessimist. Then he starts with indefinite pessimism. So an example of the indefinite pessimism is Europe at the moment, which is essentially a culture in decline. No one is super eager building new startup companies in Europe, or building great revolutionary infrastructure. They've sort of shot their bolt as a civilization in some ways. Once upon a time, Europe did control essentially the whole world, and since then those empires have dissolved. New nations stand in their place and are sovereign, and Europe has sort of withered away. I was in Europe, 10 years ago, and yeah, it does feel like a museum, especially compared to like Western Canada at the time was booming. We were building stuff. The whole world felt young out west, and then you got back to Europe, things were moving slow, and no one was, what we consider to be good jobs, they would consider to be impossible jobs. What we consider to be not so good jobs, they thought were great jobs in Europe. The people that I talked to, and people would be in school doing multiple degrees for ages, and then it's sort of one of these things you finish your third degree and then you work about 5 years and then you retire. In Europe is sort of what it seemed like. Anyway, so that's an example of indefinite pessimism. And then definite pessimism, he talks about China. So China, even though they're booming, they have a sense of pessimism which is earned because in living memory they had terrible events such as the Cultural Revolution and famines and these sorts of things. So they're always worried about how things are going to break down and how they can keep the ship righted and avoid sort of going through another huge civil war or famine or those sorts of catastrophes that, you know, aren't that far away for them. 1949, Mao was in, and, you know, there was all sorts of crazy things after that point, and before that point was essentially a huge civil war for probably over 10 years, I think. So they're grounded in that feeling of definite pessimism. Even though their economy is booming, they're worried, always worried. Then the example of definite optimism is essentially he uses America in the 50s and 60s. So think of that time. Think of the accomplishments of America during that time. They were building interstates. They had the space program. In the 40s, they had the Manhattan Project, which went from 0 to none on nuclear weapons in relatively short order. So this was a time when people were optimistic. They were stoked on the future. They were willing to put their money where their mouth was and build. Everyone was making money. You know, I guess the concept of suburbs truly sort of became what we know it now, the Beaver Cleaver sort of suburbs. Yeah, and you know, speaking from, I guess, sort of family experience, you know, my grandfather was a gentleman who really represents this well. Was an engineer off the farm where, you know, there's very little on the prairies in the 30s. Became an engineer, worked for Imperial, was out in the field right down the street basically from Leduc. The Leduc discovery, a huge discovery which basically remade Alberta's oil industry into what it sort of is now. Now we have oil sands is kind of the key thing. Anyways, moved to Calgary. That was sort of the head office city. Ran a big tank company. Had 9 kids. Ultimately set up another company which made these natural gas engines with a diesel starter. So what a perfect example of a total definite optimist. Put his money where his mouth was, in my humble opinion. And but I mean, there's a million stories like that in the 50s and 60s of the, you know, these greatest generation types. And then the last category is what Thiel calls indefinite optimism, which is where we are at in Canada and the United States right now. You know, people are optimistic, but, you know, they're not so sure about the way things are going to play out. They're certainly not off to the races in terms of building new dams and building interstates and setting up, revolutionizing industries. And so that's where I'd like to leave off, because that seems most pressing to us, because we're in, you know, I'm personally in Canada, in Alberta, a place that's probably, of all of Canada, got to be the most definite optimistic, but maybe that's what we could call the sea change that's happened in Calgary over the last 10 years, from when, in say 2006, we were definite optimists. We were building pipelines, we were trying out coal bed methane, people were messing around with shale gas. The oil sands was really starting to become a thing. People were planning mega projects in the multi-billions. There's even, you know, coal was back a thing. Grand Cache was booming. I remember I went out to Medicine Hat. They were putting in irrigation. It's just a crazy time. And now, if you look at Calgary, so we've switched in 10 years, I would say, from being definite optimists to indefinite optimists, where now we're sort of like, well, you know, we're not going to be starving anytime soon. We're not really too worried about civil war, although we could separate. That's another story. But the thing is this: we're not getting anything built. People are trying, but we can't get anything built. We can't get pipelines built. Northern Gateway destroyed by government. Energy East destroyed by government. Totally untenable for a private company to try with this applications process, which is only going to get worse with Bill C-69. Kinder Morgan expansion is in limbo indefinitely. I think it's toast till we change the federal government and send in tanks to make sure this thing gets built. Keystone XL, they are actually sort of starting to build that pending some of the usual, court challenges that you get from the usual suspects down in the States. So anyways, we're in a state of indefinite optimism. And, when I look around, I see, as sort of symptoms of indefinite optimism, think of the number one symptom I can think of is the Green New Deal, right? You hear a lot of talk about this in American politics and sort of, I guess you could call it like the LEAP manifesto, which has made an appearance in Canadian politics, never got any traction. These are sort of things that indefinite optimists like to trumpet. The reason being, they don't have to do any of the work. It sounds great on paper. Yeah, we're going to have a Green New Deal. We're going to transition to zero carbon economy. We could do it tomorrow if we wanted to. Yeah, who's the we? Who's the we? Who's going to build the windmills? Who's going to replace the coal power? Who's going to replace the natural gas? Who's going to replace the nuclear? Who's going to replace the oil? Who's going to replace the gasoline? That's something that gets glossed over by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie and Sven Robinson and those types of people. But that is the question that people should be asking if they wanted to be actual definite optimists, if they wanted to be actual mover and shakers. Instead, these people are just talkers. Talk, 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 talk. Green New Deal. Wind. We'll have an army of people, says Elizabeth May, that will go from coast to coast and they'll fix up our houses to make them more energy efficient. And that will employ all these people and we'll save money and all this good stuff. It's all BS. So that's sort of an extreme example of what happens when you get into these periods of indefinite optimism. There's sort of this vacuum. I mean, actual people who want to be productive aren't really allowed to be productive, so they just sort of have to twiddle their thumbs and produce their wells and try their best to get gas and oil to market. But then we have these other people who are sort of sharing the same space. Nothing's getting built, but we have all these grandiose plans which we're not really willing to put our back behind. We're willing to talk about them and put other people's money behind them, but not to actually get them done. So anyways, those are sort of my thoughts on those categories, the way Thiel breaks down the sort of cultural moods that you find in societies. I mean, we could probably think, let's just brainstorm, what else would be a definite optimistic society? How about England, 1800, okay? People were working on steam and building factories and building canals, and they're fighting with Napoleon for dominion over the seas, and they had, let's say in 1811 they took over Java from the Dutch. They were building trade empires, inventing things. That's a great example of definite optimism. Or maybe the rise of Rome, Julius Caesar conquering Gaul. They were building great public works projects, had powerful armies, were making tons of money through trade and through empire. Okay, let's do another definite pessimistic example. How about Russia at almost any time in its history? Right? Lots of famine, lots of tough lessons to go around for our friends in Russia, right? But maybe what would be a really, truly pessimistic time for them, not necessarily from this century, but maybe the time of the Decembrists, like 1825, when they were sort of like, look, Europe is waking up and we have this crazy czar and we have slavery still, serfdom. And, they're kind of, I'd say, definite pessimists about that whole situation, even though a few of them tried to right that ship. Another example of indefinite optimism, maybe, let's say, Rome under the 5 emperors. I mean, they were still sort of building stuff, but they weren't, truly expanding their empire in some ways. Were they? I could be wrong on that. I think at that point, they were at sort of a stable stage. No one was really worried about famine. They had a few wars that were far-flung, like against the Germans. Not really too close to home. They were sort of glory wars in some ways. So it's sort of like now, um, the wars feel far away. Uh, you know, the neighboring countries have all been subjugated. Interesting. We can think about that once more. And then indefinite pessimism. Yeah, Europe would be a good example of that. How about the late Roman Empire when the wheels were coming off and you had all sorts of crazy emperors and occasional famines and barbarians were raiding and the empire was starting to fall apart. Anyways, those are just a few thoughts that I had on that chapter. So I'm going to keep reading this book, keep thinking about it, and think about what I want to do for my next little chat. But if you like this, just drop me a line in the comments, please. You can like if you really want to. You can subscribe if you really want to. I'm not going to force you. I'm not that type of guy. But yeah, listen, drop me a line. I'd love to hear from you. It's so awesome to hear from people. I have been hearing from people on my blog posts and on my book, which you can find on Amazon. Just search my name, Sean Vanderlee, or search the title, Children of the Rockies. Check that out. And anyways, I hope that you're having a great day. You're going to have an excellent rest of your week. And, join me in the Definite Optimism camp. We'll go build an excellent crew of thinkers and doers together, and we'll conquer the world. Thank you. Have a nice night.